Hello and welcome to a new episode of Interpreting India. From geopolitical complexities to economic uncertainties, India faces critical challenges in its quest for a more prominent role on the world stage. This season, we at Carnegie India continue to bring voices from India and around the world to examine the role of technology, the economy, and international security in shaping India's future. Political scientist David Shambaugh advised analysts studying international affairs to look beyond diplomatic announcements of countries and consider the broad range of a country's engagement with foreign countries and international institutions. This becomes particularly challenging when studying China's foreign policy, which requires understanding a large number of bureaucratic agencies of the state, the party, and the military. In addition, some new players such as think tanks, media, local governments, and transnational corporations have played a key role in influencing China's foreign policy. Joining us today to discuss the domestic sources and drivers of China's foreign policy is Helena Legarda. Helena is lead analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, MERICS. Her research focuses on China's defense and foreign policies and their geopolitical impact. Prior to joining MERICS, she gained professional experience at the delegation of the European Union to China and at research and advisory firm China Policy in Beijing. Helena holds a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and has been trained in China studies at the University of Oxford. She's also studied Chinese at the Peking University. Helena, welcome to Interpreting India.
Thank you, Shibani. Thank you for having me.
We met in Berlin about a month ago now, and our interaction was so engaging. I knew that I definitely had to have you on the podcast. And like I sort of mentioned to you in our email exchange, that understanding China from outside, especially in India, has been particularly challenging, not just because of the language barrier, but also because the system in China seems so opaque. And someone like you who's followed this for a long time and has, a research focus that is particularly driven by understanding what are the domestic sources of Chinese foreign policy, I thought it would be a very interesting conversation. And it would also help us to understand how you, who's sitting in Berlin, is looking at China and where there are convergences and divergences and how we understand China as well. But before we get into the specifics of who are the key players, what are the agencies, and how do they sort of coordinate with each other, I would like to know what you think about China. China, as we know, has a distinctive personality and modus operandi. And as analysts, there have been sort of various frameworks to understand Chinese foreign policy, whether you look at the different eras, decade to decade, or look at the different personalities that have, shaped China's foreign policy, how they are distinct from each other. One approach that I particularly find interesting is how do we distinguish between China as a presence on the world stage, whereas how it has now transformed into being an influencer. I think I would just like to start off with hearing your thoughts on that.
That's a great question and a really broad one. So let me see how I do with it. I think the first thing to be said that I think is quite important, because you mentioned that quote by David Shambaugh about foreign policy pronouncements. And I agree in many cases, but I think China is a very particular case. And I think it's quite important to pay attention to what the Chinese Communist Party, to what the CCP says, especially when it's talking to itself. So when we are looking at sort of high-level party meetings, whether it's a party congress, whether it's the National People's Congress, whether it's one of the plenums of the Central Committee, like the third plenum that just concluded a few days ago. Those are, I think, the occasions where the party outlines what it wants to achieve and how. And it's important to take it seriously. These are not occasions when the party is trying to project internationally exclusively. It's rather talking to itself and to its own rank and file. So it does tell us, I think, quite a lot. And if we look at all that the party has been saying and party and state leaders have been saying since Xi Jinping came to power, say in 2013, is that China has very grand ambitions. It has grand ambitions to become a global power and to reform and reshape the current global order. The details are a bit fuzzy in terms of how they want to get there, what they want the global order to look like eventually. But that's what they want to achieve. And we see a China also that seems just much more confident in its own strengths and capabilities than we did in the past. So I think what's become quite obvious is that under Xi Jinping, so over the last 10 years or so, China has left behind this period that could be described using Deng Xiaoping's maxim, hide your time, bide your strength.
Yeah, hide your strength and bide your time.
Okay. I get confused with the translation sometimes.
I do as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So this period that could be described using Deng Xiaoping's maxim, hide your strength, bide your time, is effectively gone. We have a China that after decades rather, of economic growth, of military modernization, and of political strengthening, right? So the strengthening of the domestic institutions and the domestic structures that the party has put in place to maintain, as they call it, political stability and its control over China. After decades of that, I think the party feels that this is their moment, or Xi Jinping felt that this was China's moment. This is the moment where they could go out into the world and try and make progress towards those grand ambitions. So I think this helps explain quite a lot of the changes that we've seen in how China operates internationally. We've gone from a China that, and I think a good example is looking, for example, at international organizations, right? Think about China within the UN or other international bodies. We went from a China that wasn't particularly proactive. It was engaged. It was there. It participated, but it tended not to take a very proactive leadership role in a lot of policy files, to a China that's doing sort of the opposite. It's trying to be very active, is trying to lead in pushing certain initiatives forward, or in vetoing and killing other initiatives that it doesn't like, is trying to build coalitions of countries to push its own ideas forward. So there's been a really massive shift. And I think it's to do with that. China feels, or rather the Chinese leadership feels, that this is what they often refer to as a period of strategic opportunity for China. China now has the capabilities to push forward, and the West, quote unquote, is distracted and weakened. And this is a narrative that really, I think, took hold. It existed prior, but it really took hold after the financial crisis in the late 2000s. When Beijing saw Western countries and a lot of liberal democracies weakened, suffering economically and simply distracted by their own domestic problems. So they felt this was their moment.
Just to sort of stick on with China's moment, in one of your recent risk and security trackers that you put out, I think it opens with the sentence, 2024 is set to be a challenging year for China. But you bring out this nuance of, despite there being a war in Ukraine, a crisis in the Middle East, China's own economic kind of slowdown, in the Chinese leadership, there is a sense of optimism about the country's international position, and you spoke about it a little bit. And you've also tied it to a comment by President Xi in 2023, where he noted that major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics will enter a new stage where much more can be accomplished. And this is an interesting take. Like you said, there's a lot happening, but China seems confident. And seems satisfied with its sort of foreign policy approach, and maybe doesn't see any reason to kind of change how it's, change course. But we've reached the halfway mark in 2024. So how do you see things playing out?
I think that's the interesting dynamic when you look at China's foreign policy or China's role in the world. On the one hand, there's this grand sense of optimism and ambition, right? We want to become a global power. We can do it. We're just going to push through, push forward, and we will get there. And at the same time, there's a sense that the international environment is becoming harder and harder for China. Threats are rising. Threat perceptions within Beijing are rising. A lot of this is pinned on the United States, right? The United States is out there trying to build a coalition of countries to contain China. They want to keep China down, etc. But these things coexist. So the optimism and the grand ambitions, together with this fear that the international environment is more and more hostile towards China. But what I think is quite interesting is that the party leadership under Xi Jinping has so far, changes can always happen, but has so far given no sign that they have any intention of changing sort of the broad lines of China's foreign policy and international behavior. This doesn't mean that China doesn't adjust how they operate internationally. They of course do, right? And priorities shift, and we've seen it, for example, most recently, I think in the South China Sea, where there's some debate about what the agreement or the deal actually entailed, but there's been an agreement between China and the Philippines to try and reduce the temperature in the South China Sea. Again, I think that speaks to the wish in Beijing, or the willingness rather, to adjust their behavior when it looks like things are getting out of hand. But when it comes to the grand objectives and the general principles, there seems to be no sign, at least so far, that they intend to change course. And this, to me, suggests that they were relatively satisfied, that they think the current model, the current approach that they have put in place is the right one. And I think this is something that we're seeing under Xi Jinping, under the current party leadership, not just in foreign policy, but I think across the board. I'm not an economist myself, but looking at the third plenum of the Central Committee that just concluded, it seemed like a very similar dynamic. So a recognition of the issues, right? They're not blind in Beijing. They see the challenges, they see the problems, but also almost a doubling down on the approach. A sense of, we may be going through a storm right now, but we will weather this storm if only we sort of stand firm and we keep pushing. Will this work in the future? I think that's a question, right? How sustainable is this approach? But right now, they seem intent on just going forward along a similar path.
I do want to come back to the point that you're making about doubling down on their approach, and sort of how nationalistic sentiment kind of plays into gaining legitimacy. But before we go there, like I said in my introduction, to understand Chinese foreign policy requires an understanding of a large number of agencies and players, both state as well as non-state. As an academic exercise, or as someone who is working in policy analysis, how can we effectively study the role of different government organs, bureaucracies, and how do you integrate all these factors, whether it's what think tanks are saying, what the media is producing, what's happening at the local governance level, into a comprehensive understanding of how China engages with the world?
So there's a couple of things to take into account here. And I think the first thing to keep in mind when talking about this is simply the nature of the Chinese political system, right? So how does it work, and how has it changed under Xi Jinping? And what we have seen over the last few years is very much a centralization of power. A centralization of power in Xi Jinping himself, but also in what they call central commissions, which are often chaired by Xi Jinping himself or by other party leaders, and which play a sort of a coordination role. They sort of set policy priorities that then other departments or other actors within China must implement. So the center in Beijing is at the moment very much in the lead. This doesn't mean that there's no debate within the system or that other actors don't play a role, but they definitely have a lot less space to act independently or to take a leading role or a leadership role on anything related to foreign policy. That space has really shrunk over the last few years. And what we have also seen is that the space for public debate on China's foreign policy has shrunk as well. So when we're thinking about the role of think tanks or the role of the media, the role of civil society, that role is still there. Chinese think tanks in particular do play a role in sort of the policy making and the policy formulation process in China. But there is very little debate in the public sphere with regards to, again, the objectives of the country, the overall goals, or even the policies. There's no space for that at the moment. So a lot of what is going on when it comes to policy formulation is happening behind closed doors, which makes it very difficult for us to be able to tell exactly how it works. There are things, however, that we can see, right? We can look at everything from sort of the prioritization of certain departments in official statements or pronouncements, to budgets, to personnel, to simply who shows up to which meetings. All of these details in the end do tell us something when we take them all into account. And what I think has also been a characteristic of the Xi Jinping era is an institutionalization and a formalization of a lot of these new processes. So China, for example, passed a foreign relations law not too long ago, which set out quite clearly which are the main actors involved in foreign policy and what their role is. This isn't exactly then what it looks like in practice. As we all know, in China, this being a one-party system, the party state and the authorities have a lot of room to maneuver when it comes to all of these pieces of legislation. But again, it gives us a sense of which organizations and which groupings or which bodies have sort of gained an importance or which have been kind of left aside a little bit more. So the system is opaque. That's for sure. And the space, as I said, for debate, especially in public, is shrinking. But we can still see certain shifts, right? As I said, centralization is a very clear one. A lot of the foreign policy priorities are set at the center by Xi Jinping and by the Central Foreign Affairs Commission, which he chairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course, still plays a relatively important role, but we've seen other ministries like the Ministry of Commerce or even the Ministry of State Security become a bit more involved in sort of the international engagements of China, which is, I think, relatively new and interesting. And some of these shifts also take place linked to the ups or downs of some of China's foreign policy initiatives, right? So think about the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance. It hasn't disappeared, but it is no longer the one and only global initiative that China has. So its role has sort of been diminished slightly, which means that organizations like the Ministry of Commerce or even the China International Development Cooperation Agency are still there, but they're maybe playing a bit less of a major role when it comes to sort of foreign policy formulation. We also need to think about the role of the Ministry of Defense and the People's Liberation Army. They do a lot of defense diplomacy that we can't lose sight of. That's something that China does quite proactively, especially with countries in the quote unquote global south, for lack of a better term, but quite a lot of sort of port calls, joint exercises, or simply diplomatic exchanges at the level of ministries of defense or militaries with countries in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, generally speaking, almost around the world, to a degree that I think many countries, especially in Europe, don't really do. So that's another, I think, quite important actor to think about when we talk about foreign policy and China. But for a basic understanding of Chinese foreign policy and to see where they want to go, what the priorities are, and what the general plan is, I think I could just recommend to the audience that just pay attention to what Xi Jinping and the party leaders are saying. Pay attention to the Central Foreign Affairs Commission when they issue any statements or when they hold a conference, and pay attention to what the Minister of Foreign Affairs is saying. The top guidelines are really coming from there nowadays.
And if I'm not wrong, I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has almost a daily press briefing, if not from the minister, but at least a spokesperson, which is published online in English at least.
Yes, they absolutely do. So it's not exactly daily, but it's almost daily. It's not the minister, it's always one of the spokespeople. They have a handful, and they release them in a very timely fashion in both Chinese and in English. A recommendation from my side would be, if people can, do look at the Chinese. The official translations, they are accurate, but sometimes in translation, there's a certain degree of interpretation that it comes into play. So I think the original Chinese gives you a bit of a better sense of the sentiment, I guess you could say, behind some of the statements. But yes, they do a press briefing or a statement almost every single day.
And I think your point on defense diplomacy, so, I mean, sitting here in India and kind of looking at the India-China relationship, there was an incident along the line of actual control in 2020, and conversation has been ongoing since then for the last 4 years almost. And it's happened at the corps commander level. So there have been at least 20 rounds of talks between the incident till up until now. And of course, at the ministerial level, there have been some exchanges, meetings on the sidelines of sort of major summits, but that has been a continuous thread of engagement, of what are the friction points, what can be done to kind of disengage. And so, yeah, that was a point that struck me while you were speaking.
And I mean, I think the India case is quite particular because there's actually a disagreement over the border. There's a territorial dispute, as China calls it. So this, I think, also justifies and explains the constant engagement. But I think it's quite interesting when you look at countries far away from China, say pick a country in Africa, for instance, where there are none of those conflicts, and still the degree of sort of diplomatic exchanges at the military or at the defense level is quite high. It happens quite regularly, and China really does make a point of it.
Earlier, when we were talking about the party, you said it's important to look at how the party speaks to itself. And then you also said that the space for public debate in China on foreign policy is kind of limited. But there is also this narrative that the CCP gains a lot of legitimacy within China from the claim that it's working for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and that it has sort of doubled down on its nationalist credentials, especially in the past decade. So how do you see the party-state relationship kind of influence the worldviews of different social groups in China? And just more generally, what are the foreign policy consequences of this heightened nationalism?
I think that change definitely has taken place, at least to some degree. I think a big problem that the CCP is facing or has been facing over the last few years is that the old, I guess you could call it social contract that it had with the population no longer holds, right? So the party used to base a lot of its legitimacy and general support on the fact that they were going to deliver continued economic growth and regularly increasing prosperity. So every generation was going to be better off than the last, in exchange for the population effectively not getting involved in politics. So supporting the party system and staying out of it. And that worked relatively well for quite some time, but it's no longer working because the Chinese economy is no longer growing at that same pace. There's plenty of sort of economic or socioeconomic fault lines that have emerged over the last few years, and the COVID-19 pandemic and the measures taken around it definitely didn't help, right? So if you look, for example, at the healthcare system, it is quite strained at the moment. But so is China's pension system. China has a bit of a demographic crisis at the moment. Growth rates are not exactly there, at least not like they were in the past. There are some issues around unemployment, especially for urban educated youth. So there's lots of problems when it comes to the economy. So that old model to sustain that old social contract no longer works. So you need to come up with something else. And I think one of the new sort of pillars of legitimacy that the CCP has put forward is that you were talking about, right? We are going to return China to its rightful place in the world as a global power. And a lot of the narrative and the worldview sort of circles around the idea that China used to be a regional power and to a large extent a global power. It lost that position after sort of the Opium Wars, the century of humiliation, and it deserves that spot back. And the CCP is the only actor, the only party that can bring China back to its position and restore its role in the world and sort of bring China the respect it deserves back. And they're really pushing with this. The question you're asking, though, is very difficult to answer, is to what extent is there actual public support for this or not? And here, I think we run into the problem of the difficulties when it comes to actually analyzing public opinion or doing sort of surveys among the Chinese population when it comes to sort of core CCP policies and priorities. As I said, the space for public debate is shrinking. So I guess understandably, a lot of people don't necessarily feel comfortable maybe speaking out against some of these things. But I think what can be relatively safely said is that there is some debate in China about this. It has, to a large extent, disappeared from public view at the moment. But at the beginning of Xi Jinping's first term in power, there was, I remember, quite a lot more debate about whether this was the right time, whether this was the right time for China to become more assertive and more proactive internationally and effectively to, quote unquote, pick a fight with the US and other Western countries. That debate existed. And I'm sure it's not 100% disappeared, right? The fact that there's that there's limited space for debate doesn't mean that people don't have other views and other opinions. So I'm sure that's there somewhere in the background, including among the population. I think the reality is that many in China probably support the general concept of returning China to its rightful place as a global power, but the consequences might be a bit harder to deal with. I mean, some of these economic difficulties, etc., the trade war with the United States that's been going on since the Trump administration is probably not helping, right? And some of the tariffs or potential tariffs or some of the trade restrictions that are being imposed, not just by the US, but also by other countries, right? By Europe, by India, by Japan, that is also not contributing to China's continued economic growth. So there is a certain trade-off, I think, between these things. And the party, I think, has decided that they're going to go full steam ahead, at least for now. I am skeptical that the entire Chinese population is 100% on board with this. Something that helps the CCP with this, though, and this we also have to acknowledge, is the fact that the media is controlled, and so is the education system. So the stories and the narratives that are being presented to the population, to the kind of newer generations in schools, have a very particular sort of pro-party slant to them, right? Which also, I think, helps diminish debate.
I do recall, I think it was 2013, 2014, when the Belt and Road Initiative was announced, and there were very different views from within China itself about whether China should be going out there and helping other countries with their infrastructure development and, providing employment opportunities to locals. Whereas on the other side, it felt like that is the role of China to sort of uplift the entire world and, make it part of its own development and growth story. But I think we're hearing less and less of that since then.
Yeah, we hear it less and less, but I would bet that those kind of questions are still alive in people's minds. To what extent should China be going out there and investing in infrastructure projects or development projects in other countries overseas when our economy here is suffering? This doesn't make China an unusual sort of unicorn country, right? These are questions that I think populations have in almost every country, and I would bet that China is no different. I think the difference is to what extent does this actually then influence policy? And that is where the difference, I think, in the Chinese system really come into play. The fact that this is sort of so controlled and so centralized that the impact of these sort of public views is, I think, much more limited. It's not that it doesn't exist. I think it still does. I think the party still needs to respond to population concerns and demands, but in a very different way and to a much lesser extent.
I think now, looking at sort of new realities of the world that we're in, I'd sort of opened with the multiple crises across the globe that are currently unfolding. I'd really like to get into how Europe is now looking at its relationship with China. I was reading this report from March by the European Commission, and it said that EU-China relations are in a state of flux. And any sort of past ambition of stronger economic ties have been replaced with concerns about overdependence on China and a desire to reduce risk. So how are you looking at the bilateral relationship between the European Union and China?
We've seen very substantial changes when it comes to EU-China relations. And in particular, I think when it comes to the EU's view of China and its approach to relations with China in a very short period of time. So I think this can be partly traced back to 2016, 2017, when the discussion started. But it was in 2019 when the EU released what they call the strategic outlook on China, where for the first time it labeled China a partner, competitor, and systemic rival simultaneously. This was a big change for Europe. Up until that point, I think the relationship with China for the European Union had been very much focused on the economic sphere, on strengthening and increasing economic ties, and to a certain extent, almost leaving aside or putting aside points of friction that were more sort of political or geopolitical. In 2019, with this kind of introduction of the new approach, the machinery started moving. And this process has really accelerated over the last couple of years. And it has landed us with the EU's current strategy or policy of de-risking towards China. Mind you, it's de-risking, not decoupling, but the focus is very much, on trying to reduce or mitigate the risks that emerge from our kind of relationship or exchanges with China. Beijing often sort of hits back at this and criticizes Europe. And a lot of the argument is, this is America, right? It's the US in the background that has forced Europe to do this. I think that is an absolute misrepresentation of what's happened in Europe. I am not going to deny that the US under the Trump administration did put the China issue on the table. And it forced Europe to a certain extent to have a second look at it. But the shifts that have taken place in Europe, I think, can be traced back to changes in China's own international behavior. Beijing, as we discussed earlier in this conversation, has started behaving, I think, a lot more assertively, if not aggressively, internationally. And I think for Europe, it was too many instances in which China's behavior or China's policies hit Europe very directly and very negatively in too short a period of time. So, I mean, just a couple of examples, but if we go back to 2021, we have the case of measures of economic coercion against Lithuania after Lithuania approved the opening of a Taiwan representative office in the country. And you can argue economic coercion is not new, right? So many other countries, especially in Asia or the Indo-Pacific, have suffered it. Yes, but this hit an EU member state and a member of the single market very directly, right? So that was relatively new. And I think it was a bit of a wake-up call for many in Europe that China was willing to weaponize economic ties for geopolitical or strategic objectives. That same year, you had basically the exchange of sanctions. So China's retaliation and escalation against the EU's imposition of sanctions on a very small number of Chinese officials over human rights violations in Xinjiang. And China responded by sanctioning a very high number of European actors, right? From members of the European Parliament to members of national parliament, some ambassadors and government officials, think tanks, academics, across many European countries. And the effect of this was that the comprehensive agreement on investment that had been agreed to in principle between the EU and China was killed. Realization for many in Europe, China is increasingly willing today to accept economic costs for political goals. So it's not just about weaponizing economic ties. It's about politics above economics for Beijing today. And then this was 2021, right? In 2020, we had the big crackdown on Hong Kong. We've had an continuous increase on the pressure, including militarily, that China has put on Taiwan. And then after 2021, you also have the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And how China handled it at the beginning, the whole wolf warrior diplomacy that came with it. The use of the pandemic by China to push kind of certain narratives of systemic superiority, which really weren't appreciated in Europe. And together with the COVID-19 pandemic, then you have China's support for Russia's invasion and war of aggression against Ukraine. And I think it's not only that both China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and to the Russian invasion of Ukraine very much hit European interests, but I think they also led to a bit of an acceleration of thinking when it comes to over-dependencies for different reasons, right? When it came to the war in Ukraine, this was about over-dependence on Russia, Russian gas in particular. When it came to the COVID-19 pandemic, we're talking about over-dependence mostly on China for medical supplies, masks, PPE, certain kind of medicines, etc. But it led to, I think, a lot more thinking about the wisdom, or rather the lack of wisdom of being over dependent for critical goods or critical supply chains on single countries. And this really, I think, has led to this new approach of de-risking. China has changed its international behavior. A lot of the behaviors that we used to see from China, maybe more domestically or in the region, have gone really global, and they've started hitting Europe very directly. And that's led to a rethink. It's probably a rethink that should have happened earlier. But here we are. And now the process and what we are watching and what the EU and its member states are working on and will continue working on is implementation, right? So when we talk about de-risking, what exactly does this look like? What are the trade-offs? Who implements, etc.? And it's complicated, and it's a slow, gradual process, but that's the current path.
And I would imagine that one is arriving at this consensus that there needs to be de-risking. But the implementation will involve consultations and dialogue with a variety of stakeholders, from member states to the EU to the Commission, different agencies, different departments within governments. And I mean, like you said, I think it's important that the consensus has been reached on this is what needs to be done. But I think the interesting part now would be to see how it's implemented. Again, on implementation, if the EU is careful not to decouple from China entirely, but just de-risk, it is obviously looking to diversify and looking for partners in the Indo-Pacific. I read somewhere that South Korea, Australia, then there are countries in Africa that sort of EU could partner with to kind of diversify away from China. What role do you see other countries in the Indo-Pacific specifically playing in this implementation phase? And also, how do you see kind of India featuring in this conversation?
Before I get to that point, an additional sort of couple of comments on implementation that you were talking about, how this is complex. It absolutely is, right? The EU is a complicated beast. So I think we need to account for the fact that there's 27 EU member states, right? Besides the EU institutions, and they all have, to a certain extent, slightly different views of China and the degree to which China is a risk or not. Different types of relations with China, right? And different degrees of prioritization of China, even as sort of a foreign policy focus. But there's also a whole question of the difference in competences between the EU and the member states, right? Who's responsible for what? The traditional division of labor was the EU does economic policy, and national security is up to the capitals, up to the member states. Where does economic security fall? Right? It's somewhere in the middle. And Brussels, so the EU Commission, the European Commission has been taking the lead on a lot of these measures of economic security. But this is by no means a settled debate, that it is the EU's role to kind of push forward and make policy on a lot of these issues, right? So again, loads of very different takes about who needs to do what or who can do what. So it is going to be tricky, but I don't want to sort of undersell the progress. The progress that has been made so far, I think, is quite remarkable, both in terms of perspective and consensus building, but also in terms of implementation. If you look at all the instruments that the EU has developed and approved over the last few years, it really is quite impressive, especially given standard EU policymaking speeds. But getting to India, or to the diversification question, without going into too much detail on the numbers, the partner or partnership aspect is one of the three pillars of the EU's economic security strategy, right? It is seen as extremely important. I mean, if the EU wants to increase its economic security and sort of reduce risks when it comes to its economic ties with China, I think there's an aspect of sort of building up or strengthening the EU's own competitiveness and own resilience, so that the sort of looking inward side of things. There's an element of actual sort of protection, right? Developing the tools to protect the single market and to protect European industries from risks coming in. But as you said, if you want to diversify, you need partners. And the EU is, I think, investing a fair bit into this. And there's quite a lot that's being done in terms of sort of digital partnerships with other countries. The Global Gateway, I think, is another tool that comes into place here. There's some negotiations still ongoing for various kind of free trade agreements or similar. And India definitely plays a role. And I think a very clear sign that India can play an important role in the EU's economic security strategy and diversification efforts is that the EU and India have set up a trade and technology council, like the one that the EU has with the US, right? If I remember correctly, this EU-India TTC met for the first time last year in 2023. At some point in the spring, I want to say in May, perhaps it was June, but it's a relatively recent development. But I think it shows the fact that the EU is interested in exploring those opportunities and that collaboration.
Yeah, and I think the EU-India TTC has a lot of potential, not just for the EU and India, but also to demonstrate the strength of a partnership like that for other countries as well that are looking to de-risk or diversify away from China. But thank you so much, Helena. Thank you for this very wide-ranging conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, sort of learning from you on how to kind of understand China better, what are the approaches that one can adopt, to also getting a better understanding of how Europe is looking at China versus what we here in India kind of view China, the difference in perception, I think is, again, very interesting to kind of dig deep into. And I hope this is the first of many conversations that you and I have at the podcast. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Shibani. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation. Loads of topics, I think, to dig into in further conversation. So I hope you will have me back for future podcasts at some point. And maybe I'll just finish up with the caveat. I am European and based in Europe, but I don't think I can claim to represent all of Europe's perspectives on this. But take this as one perspective coming out from one analyst sitting at a think tank in Berlin. And I hope the audience finds it interesting.
I'm 100% certain of that. Thank you so much. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.